Perhaps one of the most iconic scenes in Disney's 1963 classic The Sword and the Stone is the magical duel between Merlin and Madame Mim. Each of them changes form to try to best the other, until Mim cheats and Merlin finally defeats her. Although it should be said that this sequence is more inspired by the novel on which the film is based, the Arthurian legend. Yet it does set up the notion of shapeshifting as having a magical component. The idea of witches being able to turn into other animals, notably hares and cats, is an old one, with other tales exploring the ability of witches to turn people into horses. But how did the story say they actually managed these transformations? Well, let's have a look at shape-shifting witches in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are cracking on with Reader Request Month, and like I said last week, this is going to be the second in a two-parter because, to be honest with you, the topic of shapeshifting, which was requested, is massive. So obviously we looked at fairies and other supernatural creatures last week, and this week we're going to look at magical shapeshifting, specifically how it relates to witches and witchcraft. And to be honest, it is a massive topic and there's a lot of scope, so we're not having a look at gods and goddesses or any of the magical transformations of those types, although, like I say, I may do an episode on that in the future. I should point out, of course, that the focus is also going to be on Europe, but mostly the British Isles. But if you would like to know more about the shape-shifting abilities of witches in other parts of the world, then I would recommend that you check out The Witch by Ronald Hutton, and a link is in the show notes below. But we're just basically going to get cracking because there's again quite a lot to cover. So witches are most often believed to be able to turn into animal form, and I suppose, to be fair, witches are most often associated with animals through the huge array of familiars that they keep, and obviously there is a previous episode about witches' familiars if you're interested. But in other tales, the witches themselves are actually believed to turn into animals. Now, shapeshifting sometimes emerged in confessions, and courts would sometimes accept reports as evidence of the witch's guilt, and I do say guilt in inverted commas there. But whether it was a demonic illusion or a literal transformation, shapeshifting still linked the witch and the devil. That said, Owen Davies notes that shapeshifting witches are quite common in folklore, but they're less common in 16th and 17th century records. So while shapeshifting was quite important to witch lore, it doesn't actually seem to have appeared that much in court cases, although Davies suggests that this could be due to the relatively harmless animals linked with witches in the British Isles. In mainland Europe, witches were said to turn into wolves and attack people. Obviously, few people in Britain were going to be at risk from a witch in the form of a toad. Now, Julian Goodare notes that cats were quite a common form for witches to shapeshift into, because unlike today, cats lived outside in the barn as working animals around the farm, so they were a little bit more feral than fully domesticated, and they lived on the boundary between kind of domestication and total wildness. And obviously even the unpredictability of cats made them really good candidates for demonic shapeshifters. Meanwhile, hares, which was another popular option, were prey animals rather than predators, but they were also unpredictable, fast and hard to catch, so being able to avoid your enemies was believed to be a useful skill for both witches and hares. And indeed, turning into a hare also allowed witches to race across the fields to attend sabbats or steal butter and milk from their neighbours. Now, in certain parts of Wales, Ireland, Scotland and Scandinavia, people believed that witches would turn into hares to suckle from cows and thus steal their neighbours' milk. Now, by the 19th and 20th centuries, most of the records of this belief actually comes from northern England, and in North Yorkshire, one witch named Nancy Newgill apparently transformed into a hedgehog to steal milk, and quite frankly, if you're wondering how that would even begin to work given the height of a cow and the height of a hedgehog, then you're wondering the same thing as me. But witches thus transformed apparently also ate or damaged the agricultural produce of their neighbours, and I'm pretty sure you too can see the problem with thinking that the hare eating your cabbages is a witch in disguise. Now, occasionally people did think that witches could turn into dogs, birds or insects as well, and Goodare notes witches confessing to shapeshifting into whales so they could sink ships in Norwegian and Icelandic narratives. Now, elsewhere, the witch might not shift their form, but the devil might, so various animals were also considered to be the devil in disguise as well. Owen Davies notes that the animals varied by location, so in Lincolnshire, witches might appear as toads, dogs or magpies, and in Gwent they might be rats or greyhounds. Although witches weren't restricted to animals either, so much like the Headley cow and its ability to appear as inanimate objects that we encountered last week, one witch in Durham might take the form of a large sheet draped over a hedge. Again, how did anyone know? But this is indeed what appears in the records. And even as late as 1837, a young woman accused a witch of transforming into the Jack of Hearts after previously taking the form of a black cat. Now that's an incredibly specific image there, and obviously we don't quite know what was going on, but the fact that that one's a 19th century story does make you wonder exactly where these things came from. But of course the other thing that we start to get is this idea that if the witch is harmed in its animal form, that will then turn up on the human as well. And a 13th century report by Gervase of Tilbury actually noted that women had been wounded while in the form of cats and then turned up the next day with corresponding wounds while in human form. And something very similar pops up in the Jack tale related by Ed Karshner in our interview about Appalachian folklore. But by 1663, the belief that witches could shapeshift was so entrenched that confessions including shapeshifting were instantly considered to be true. Now, surprisingly, the belief in shapeshifting abilities of witches actually survived into the 20th century in the different parts of the British Isles. So exactly how do you go about shifting your form? Well, famed witch Isabel Gowdy provided a range of charms during her confession, and I do use that in inverted commas, in 1662. So according to legend, she'd met the devil twice, once on the road and once in Allen's Kirk, and to baptise her in his satanic ways, the devil sucked some of her blood out of a scratch on her shoulder. He spat this into his hand and then baptised her with it. And this then apparently gave her her various magical powers. So when she or other witches wanted to turn into a hare, the charm read, I shall gae until I an hare, with sorrow and sick and mickle care, and I shall gae in the devil's name, and quibble I come home again. To turn back into human form, they recited, Hare, hare, God send thee care, I am in a hare's likeness just now, but I shall be in a woman's likeness ere now. So obviously the idea being that you're sort of saying, I'm currently a hare, but I will be in a woman's likeness now. It does appear, because with the format of these charms, that they did actually work fairly instantaneously. But witches apparently, according to Gowdy, could also turn into cats. And the charm for this one was, I shall gae into a cat, with sorrow and sick and a black shat, and I shall gae in the devil's name, and quill I come home again. And they could even turn into crows as well. I shall gae until a crow, with sorrow and sick and a black throw, and I shall gae in the devil's name, I quill I come home again. And all of these were actually reported in an 1890 issue of the Newcastle Courant. Now, if you do try any of these, then you do so at your own risk, although I would be fascinated to know if any of them actually worked. Now, one thing that I wanted to just draw attention to was the belief in shapeshifting witches, and Julian Goodare does note that people didn't really believe folkloric narratives wholesale, in the way that I think sometimes we can think that they must have done. And he said that people assessed the tale based on what they actually knew. So, he gives the example of a person hearing a report that a woman in the village could turn into a hare. Now, the person hearing this wouldn't immediately dismiss the story based on its impossibility, but rather they would ask themselves if the person giving the report was trustworthy. They would also evaluate if the accused woman already had a magical reputation, or they might also think to see if the hare sighting matched any unusual events. And it was depending on these answers that the person would decide if they thought the report was true or not, which quite frankly I think demonstrates quite a high level of discernment. And I think this can sometimes be a bit of a problem that we have when we look at old records. We assume that people in earlier centuries were these really credulous people who just believed anything they were told, and clearly they weren't. It's just the way that I think sometimes they're portrayed by the people who did the collecting, who obviously, don't forget, there's a class element there. But I like this idea that people might go, do you know what? You've said that woman can turn into a hare, but last week you also said X, which wasn't true. And then they might just go, yeah, that's just nonsense. Or indeed, they might simply go, do you know what? That woman has no reputation for magical ability at all. I've no idea where this story's come from. And again, they might then dismiss it. But they wouldn't dismiss it because it was impossible to turn into a hare. They would dismiss it based on these other factors instead. Now, one story does seem to have been more of a rural legend than a true tale, and I've called it a rural legend, so it's kind of the countryside equivalent of an urban legend. but it seems to have been passed around more than people actually believed it ever happened in one single place. And this is the idea where hunters could never quite catch a particular hare in the area. It always managed to escape, and it always disappeared in the same place near a witch's cottage. And on those occasions when the hunters knocked on the door, they would find the witch at home, but she'd be strangely out of breath. And as part of this particular legend, one of the hunting dogs would always manage to bite the hare, and the woman would then appear a few days later with a wounded leg. The tale does sometimes see the same events, but with a cat instead of a hare, and the story even appears as late as the 1930s in Sussex and the 1960s in Somerset. But again, it just goes to show how entrenched that idea of, oh, if I injure this particular creature that is the current form of the witch, then I will also injure the witch as well. And that was obviously what we mentioned earlier. It is quite an interesting sort of take that you get with these tales. But of course, shapeshifting wasn't restricted to the witches. They could also turn other people into other forms. Now, in these particular stories, it tends to be horses. And obviously, if you're familiar with Greek mythology, and I didn't really want to mention goddesses, but Kirk is a bit of a funny one because she's also kind of almost the patron of witches. Obviously, she turns Odysseus's crew into swine. So there is this element of being able to turn other people into another form of animal. Now, William Henderson, friend of the podcast, relates a tale from Yarrowford in Scotland where a blacksmith had 2 apprentices. The younger one was growing lean and pale, and he was just getting worse and worse, but he wouldn't expand on what ailed him. Eventually, he confessed to the elder apprentice, who was his brother, that their mistress was a witch, and she was using a magic bridle every night to turn him into a horse and then riding him to exhaustion on the moors so that she could attend her feasts with other supernatural beings. Then he would carry her back in the early morning, and he would end up far too exhausted to work the next day. Now, his brother decided to catch her at it because this did not sit well with him at all, so he swapped beds with the younger apprentice. The witch arrived as expected and turned the elder brother into a hunting horse with her magic bridle. He then carries her to the nearby home of a laird, where they're having their carousing and what have you in the cellar. And while she's having this jolly time during the night, the apprentice in horse form starts to rub his head against the wall. He manages to loosen the bridle, and then when it falls off, he turns back into his human self again. He then hides at the back of the stall and waits for the witch to return, at which point he throws the bridle over her and turns her into a grey mare. He then rides her to exhaustion, although he does realise at one point that she's lost a shoe. So he finds a smithy that's opened early and then has her re-shod, and then also has the shoe on the other front foot done as well, just kind of so that she's got 2 even new shoes on. And then he wears her out riding her up and down in a field on the way home. And she manages to get back just in time for her to get back into bed in human form before the blacksmith awakes. Later on in the day, the mistress is complaining of being ill, but she won't tell anyone what the problem is. And eventually, the blacksmith has to call a doctor. And he throws back the bedclothes and discovers these horseshoes nailed to her hands. And her sides are completely covered in bruises where the apprentice had been kicking her during the ride. And the boys finally speak up and they tell their master what's happened. Now, luckily, he sides with them, not his wife, and she's actually tried at Selkirk and then burned as a witch soon after. And they managed to cure the younger brother by getting him to eat butter that was made from the milk of cows that had grazed in churchyards. And this kind of idea of a story does actually appear elsewhere in Iceland, Belgium and Denmark. Now, Henderson explains that the popularity of this story type is because witches often couldn't access horses due to the horseshoes nailed on or above stable doors. So these were keeping witches out of stables so that they couldn't be hag-ridden. There are obviously other methods for preventing that as well, which are in the stone episode, if I remember correctly. But turning humans into horses was basically the only way that witches could get their hands on them, which probably explains why stories see witches turn humans into horses but few other animals, because what would really be the point of you turning a person into like a snail or something like that? It wouldn't really do you much good, whereas a horse is quite useful. Now, of course, you do have to wonder why they couldn't just simply turn into horses themselves, but there's a good chance that they just didn't want to wear themselves out on the way to their meeting. So what do we actually make of shape-shifting witches? Well, it's quite surprising, I think, that the shape-shifting abilities of the witch, or the belief in them rather, survives into the 20th century, despite the scant evidence for it in British court records in earlier periods. And I think this perhaps demonstrates the extent to which the witch turning into a hare or a cat has basically penetrated popular consciousness. But I think that this idea of people being able to spot a witch by an injury that such is received in animal form is also quite a persuasive one. And I think this does appear in stories all over the place. You get it in Ireland as well. And I think that it helps to demonstrate that people maybe were quite wary about neighbours in particular. So I think people would probably watch out perhaps for seemingly unexplained injuries and assume that it was something attained in animal form. But it is quite interesting a lot of the time that when they do turn in animal form, it's either to steal produce from neighbours or attend their meetings. So it is quite a narrow set of reasons why somebody would turn into an animal or try to turn into an animal in the first place. And I do think that these stories where witches then turn people into animals, it's quite interesting that they have to do that with a magical item and not just a charm. And it's nearly always a bridle, which is quite interesting because that then takes us towards tales of kelpies and how you can bring them under control with their bridles as well. So I think there's some interesting crossover going on there. But ultimately, that is where the shape-shifting abilities of witches seems to begin and end. The idea of them turning into animals or turning other people into animals. And I just thought it was quite interesting to see how there was evidence of it in the folklore, and it does occasionally appear in the court records and the confessions as well. Indeed, that's how we know Isabel Gaudi's, and she goes into a lot of detail about this as well. So I hope you found that particular episode interesting. We are staying with the witch theme next week because this was another request episode for royal witches. So think people like Jacquetta of Luxembourg and Elizabeth Woodville. So I'm going to have a look at those as well. So I hope that that's something that interests you. And I'll let you know in advance, the bonus episode for this month is actually going to be about the folklore and legends associated with Mary King Close in Edinburgh, because I did an episode on the Edinburgh Vaults for Subterranean Month back in November, and I said, oh, if anyone's interested, I'll do Mary King Close as well. And a couple of people said, yes, so I'm going to do that as a request. So if you would like access to the bonus episode, or indeed the storytelling episode, which is based on an Irish story involving a witch who turned into a ghostly pair of legs, then by all means, come and join the fun on Patreon, and you can get access to like a massive archive of content that I've already created, plus anything new that I create as well. So without any further ado, I'll let you crack on with whatever else you need to do on this particular Saturday, and I will see you next week when we meet some royal witches. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.